I think we're live. Yeah. Okay. Hi.
Hi.
Hi, everybody. Okay, here we are facing the world and all these wonderful people out there watching us. And my name's Metta Spencer. I'm in Toronto, and my friends are scattered all over Southern Ontario, and even sort of Eastern Ontario, Ottawa. And we're going to have a conversation tonight about the notion of a UN emergency peace service, which is sort of a, maybe it's like peacekeeping on steroids or something, high-level improvement on the way we would go about protecting people in emergency situations where there's conflict and danger of war. And but first, I want to tell you why we're doing this. Every Monday night, I've been holding a conference on Zoom, which then gets streamed onto Facebook Live. And you folks can watch it and make comments and ask questions if you want, although nobody seems to do that much. And then it stays up afterward. But the immediate reason for doing these weekly conversations is to sort of prepare people who are interested in some of the issues that are going to come up at a conference that is very near to now. It's a forum called How to Save the World in a Hurry. And on Wednesday and Thursday, May the 30th and 31st, all day long, at the University of Toronto, University College, in fact, we will be having a number, about 30-some experts who will give us their thoughts about how to reduce the risk of 6 global catastrophes. And those are war and weapons, especially nuclear, of global warming, famine, pandemics, massive radiation exposure from something like a reactor explosion, and cyber attacks. And all of these are serious, grave threats to humankind that we need to be working on. But the people who work on them are sort of in different silos and don't get together very much. And I think because these issues are interconnected, that the public policies that we develop should be a single unified package and should be related to each other, and we should look at how they relate to each other. So that's the purpose of this conference. And if you are interested in coming, please go to our website. It's called tosavetheworld.ca, and you can find all kinds of information about what this project is like and what you will do, and pictures of the participants and their qualifications and so on. So you may want to even there to click on a button and buy yourself a ticket. In any case, the various issues that will come up in that those 2 days are quite diverse, and they require us to think about, in a rather visionary way, about changes that need to be made in global governance, in global financial arrangements, fundraising for international development projects and requirements and so on, and including preparing for protecting people, because we're going to have to get rid of a lot of our military. National armies are way too dangerous for a lot of reasons, and we need an alternative. How are you going to protect people if they reduce their military? So that's one of the things that we want to bear in mind tonight. With all that preliminary, let me tell you who these fine men are. One of them is Peter Langille, who has a PhD from Bradford University in England, which is I think the main thing they do there is peace. They do an awful lot of educating people in peace studies. And he has been very involved with this whole notion of UN Emergency Peace Service. And in fact, even before that, he was instrumental in getting the ill-fated Pearson Peacekeeping Center created in Nova Scotia, which was wonderful for a while, and then somebody pulled the plug on it. The guy, a prime minister whom I will not mention here. pulled the plug on it. It doesn't exist anymore. But he's still working to make sure that a similar thing gets created on the global scale. And we also have Robin Collins, who is based in Ottawa, and he is in every peace organization that I can think of. He's vice president of the Canadian Pugwash group now, and he's very involved with the World Federalist movement as well. And I'm not even going to list all the other things he does, but I find him a very helpful person in organizing the event that I'm working on now. And finally, I don't know in what order these guys are going to speak, but Timothy Donais is a man I've known for a number of years. When he was, I think, a graduate student at York University, he was kind enough to join the editorial group of Peace Magazine, which I edit. And so we got to be quite friendly in those days. And then he went on and did a lot of work in Bosnia, in peacekeeping, and I think the OSCE projects in Bosnia, and was then teaching political science at the University of Windsor, and now is at Wilfrid, Laurier, where he runs a program in global studies or something close to that title. So we're going to have, they all know a bit and different bits about the idea of a United Nations emergency peace service. And I want, therefore, for Peter, who's probably the most connected to the idea, has written about it, published books about it, and given lectures everywhere on the idea. Peter Langille, will you please explain to us and to the world what an emergency, a UN emergency peace service would be?
Thanks, Metta. Let me first say that we're trying to encourage support for the development of a UN emergency peace service, effectively a UN 911 first responder for complex emergencies. Why? Well, the four priority roles of UNEPs are longstanding UN challenges where we're not doing well. The UNEP's idea was specifically designed to prevent armed conflict and mass atrocity crimes, to protect civilians at extreme risk, to ensure prompt startup of demanding UN operations, and to address human needs in areas where others either won't or can't. Now, there are a dozen or 10 core principles of UNEPs, but I think they probably can come on as we have a discussion.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. All right. Actually, I want to know more than that.
Okay.
I want you to tell me what.
Let me tell you that what we're talking about is a standing, integrated, permanent UN formation, one that's highly trained and well-equipped, one that's immediately available upon Security Council authorization, one that's multidimensional in that it has civilians, police, and military, that it's multifunctional and capable of diverse assignments, whether in security, humanitarian, health, or even environmental crisis response. One that's composed of 13,500 dedicated professionals who would be co-located at a UN base under an operational headquarters and 2 mobile mission headquarters. This composition would be designed to ensure both regional and gender equitable representation. It would be co-located at a UN base, as mentioned, and at sufficient strength to operate in high threat environments. And it's a service that's really designed to complement existing UN and national arrangements, not one to replace them. But as a first responder, it gives the UN the ability to cover the initial 6 months with a very sophisticated mechanism until governments, the member states, the troop and police contributors are actually ready to respond. So aside from a military formation to deter aggression, we're looking at a police force to maintain law and order, as well as an array of civilian teams to provide essential services. And when I say an array of civilian teams, these span everything from conflict resolution teams, peace building advisory groups, medical teams, human rights monitors, disaster assistance response teams, environmental crisis response units, really a full suite of what you would need to respond to diverse complex emergencies.
Can I just ask? I know the answer, but let me raise it because I know a lot of people get confused on this. Could you clarify what's meant by a standing force as distinct from, let's say, a standby force, and what's the significance of that?
I think you can tell me as well as I can tell you. A standing force is a permanent UN formation. It's always available in high readiness, and it's either training for an operation, deployed to an operation, or in rest and recuperation from an operation. A standby, well, very few governments put their resources, their people on standby. There are almost none in the world who are actually earmarked for UN peacekeeping specifically in the military. So we, for 20 years in the UN, tried to establish a UN standby arrangement system. It attracted, 80-some pledges of participants, but it was virtually useless in ensuring rapid and reliable deployment, which was its primary purpose. Now, they had 4 levels of readiness, and irrespective of what level countries attained, it didn't make them any more quick or responsive. And all governments tend to assess the risks. They look over their shoulder to consult, they wait and they delay, then they negotiate and establish conditions by which they might participate. And it's a slow, arduous process.
How slow is it? What's a typical length of time between when the UN or whoever decides that they need to send some troops or peacekeepers and the time they actually get there and start functioning? What's an average period of time?
Well, it's far worse now than it was at the outset of peacekeeping in '56.
Oh.
And then we could actually manage to have people in the field in UNF 1 in a week, in the Congo in 6 days, in UNF 2 within 24 hours. Now the average length of time ranges from 6 to 12 months or more. And to bring missions up to full strength is a longer period. So this phenomenon of routine delays has not only put a lot of people at risk and not stemmed the escalation and spread of conflict, but it's also increased the costs for the UN because now they've shifted to a focus on post-conflict stabilization rather than preventive deployment of any nature. And as a result, the missions we see are later, larger, longer, and far costlier. So what we've proposed is partially deemed to be a much more cost-effective option, at least to have a first responder that can help.
Why is it taking longer now?
Member states are more reluctant now, and usually those who are willing to deploy are those who have less capability than those who finance the operations. So it's the southern member states who provide the troop and police contributors in general, and it's the northern member states who provide the finances.
Okay. Now, it sounds like just an amplification or a modification of an earlier pattern of peacekeeping. Tim, you've had experience with peacekeeping, I think, in Bosnia. And could you comment on the comparison between what you've experienced or what you think of as typical of peacekeeping and what Peter has just described?
Well, I guess I would start by saying that I think what Peter's outlined in terms of an emergency peace force is an eminently good idea, and has been an eminently good idea for a long time. It responds to a lot of the things that we know are fundamental flaws within the current model of peacekeeping, one of which is, as Peter, I think, rightly mentioned, sort of the long delay it takes between the mandating of a mission and actually getting people into the field. One of the examples I've just come across on this was in the case of South Sudan. There was a regional response force mandated in the aftermath of the crisis in 2013. I think there was only 1,000 troops who were ever put in the field out of a 4,000 troop commitment. So it's one of the examples, I think, of the difficulty of actually matching mandates with resources. In terms of the Bosnia mission, I think one of the big differences, and Peter mentioned this as well, is who's actually doing the peacekeeping. In the years of the early 1990s, the majority of peacekeepers came from Western nations, and Canada had several thousand peacekeepers on the ground in Bosnia during that conflict. Now it's upwards of 80 to 85% of peacekeepers come from the global South, right? So if you look at the ranking tables of peacekeeping contributors, you see countries like Ethiopia, you see countries like Rwanda, you see countries like Jordan and Bangladesh and India and Pakistan. Right. These are the sort of the frontline contributors to peacekeeping missions. They also are the ones who don't necessarily have the greatest technological capabilities to put towards multi-dimensional peace missions. And that's one of the other things that has changed, is that these conflicts have become more complex. There are more factions involved. We're now dealing with not only the challenge of peace building, but also challenges of counterterrorism and anti-radicalization, the challenges of trying to protect civilians caught up in conflict, and trying to anticipate where these POC challenges will emerge. So as they say, peacekeeping has changed significantly. It's no longer your grandfather's peacekeeping and those who think that peacekeeping is about what it looked like in Cyprus in the early 1960s. I mean, it's a very different game, and it's much more dangerous, I think, as well, to be a peacekeeper in 2018 than it was even in the early 2000s, when it was also reasonably dangerous.
Well, in fact, let me interrupt and ask about the current discussion about sending Canadian peacekeepers to, I think, Mali. I don't know where that stands at the moment, but I believe that decision was made a while back. And there was a lot of controversy about whether or not it was a smart idea, because peacekeeping has become so dangerous. I'm not quite sure why it has become more dangerous, or whether the procedures and ways of functioning as a peacekeeper have changed. And they're doing, I would hate to reach the conclusion, which I've heard people say, that peacekeeping nowadays is basically war fighting on behalf of one side or another. Tell me, is that the case? And I know I'm kind of steering this conversation away from where it belongs, but I'd like to have some reaction to those concerns that I've heard other people express. And I don't care who answers it. In fact, maybe all of you want to answer it.
I don't think peacekeeping has become war fighting at all. I haven't seen. We did see with the Brahimi report in 2000 that the UN was finally allowing peacekeepers to use force in self-defense, in defense of the mission, and in protection of civilians. Now, over the ensuing period, a lot has been done to develop robust peacekeeping with a deterrent capacity to protect the operation. But in the last year and a half, we've seen quite a high rate of fatalities. Actually, I think it's close to 100. And that's alarmed the UN to the point where we saw the recent report by Lieutenant General Cruz, who advocated on behalf of more aggressive peacekeeping, moving toward enforcement and overwhelming force. That might take us somewhat closer to being problematic. But to date, almost every UN use of force has been solely to advance a peace process. It's not aggressive force, really. It's meant to ensure a sustainable peace.
I think if I can just jump in, Metta.
Yeah.
I think it's telling in that context that the one exception to that rule, which was in the mission in the DRC, has actually caused quite a bit of controversy, and that was the establishment of the multinational intervention brigade that was actually mandated specifically to go after and eliminate one of the rebel groups that was active in the eastern DRC, and that's, I think, been one of the most controversial developments in peacekeeping over the past 5 or 10 years, because it did seem to be mandating of a specific element of a UN mission to actually go to war on behalf of a government against one of the rebel groups, and of course there's all sorts of complications that creates in terms of the position of peacekeepers vis-a-vis international humanitarian law, for example, when they all of a sudden start to become parties to the conflict. So it's caused, I think, a lot of thinking within the UN about really this long-standing question of the use of force in the name of peace. And the Hippo report, which came out a couple of years ago, reflected on this and was very cautious, in fact, in terms of advocating the extent to which the UN should actually be using force on behalf of one side or another to the conflict, both in terms of the logistical questions of that, but also more importantly, I think, the political questions of taking one side versus another.
What is the Hippo report? Did you say Hippo?
Hippo, yes. It's the high-level independent panel on peace operations. It's one in a long line of peacekeeping reports that go back to the Brahimi report, which has been advocating and trying to solve the puzzle of peacekeeping reform over the past couple of decades.
And including the problem of rapid deployment. That was one of the foci of the Hippo report. And Peter did put a contribution into that. I wanted to go back to the Mali example. And because we'd spoken about the problem of delay that might be addressed by UNEPs. And quite aside from what the mandate issues are and whether they're changing or not, which is controversial as well. If we were to take the Mali case wherein a capacity was required urgently, and there was really none available either as a peacekeeping, maybe peacekeeping wouldn't have been effective anyway, but even peacekeeping wasn't available urgently, and the French went in did good or not, depending on how you want to look at it. But let's say they did some good things. But the problem there is, this is a problem that UNEPs to a certain extent addresses, which is that a post-colonial power like France or anyone else, whether it's NATO or the British or whatever, that the UN puts out a call for capacity, and the only ones available are those with this baggage. That can be problematic in a country like Mali, where the French are seen as a colonial power. So what if the UN puts in a request and there is a UN, well, it wouldn't be a request anymore, it would be authorizations through the Security Council, and the UN can provide then its own capacity early so that it isn't necessarily a war cessation situation anymore. It's a war prevention situation. So it's a very different caliber of story, and the key part is rapidity of getting in there fast before it escalates and becomes a mess.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask you a hypothetical question that actually was a real one a few years ago when I remember when Gaddafi said that he was going to go door to door in Benghazi and eradicate people like rats.
Right.
And clearly this is a situation which called for some kind of action to protect those people. So I think, there are all kinds of troops that went in and fought on behalf of one side. I don't know whether they call themselves peacekeepers. I don't think they did.
No.
But at that point, my theory was it would have been lovely to have real peacekeepers who would simply fly in, put themselves between Gaddafi's forces and the people in Benghazi. I'm oversimplifying, of course, but say, now you guys stop. We're here between you. You got to put your weapons down. You can't shoot at each other or we'll shoot back. And you stay where you are. And now let's have a ceasefire and we'll have a negotiation of what's going to happen next. Now, to me, that's sort of the notion of the way I visualize peacekeeping as being way back when. Maybe I was naive then too, but people said, "Oh no, you couldn't do that. You couldn't have done that." Why couldn't you have done that? I mean,
well, that's one of the, in my mind, Rwanda being another, but that's in my mind is one of the best arguments for a UNEPS, which is you had, like you say, at the time, the UN Security Council was in agreement, and I mean all 15 members, not just the P5, that there was an impending civil crisis in Benghazi. We can, after the fact, go back and say, oh, it wasn't as bad as we thought it was going to be. But, at the time, there was no question. Everyone believed that there was this impending crisis that could lead to, tens of thousands of deaths imminently. So the UN Security Council authorized authorized a mission, but this wasn't necessarily a peacekeeping mission, but you could argue that peacekeepers would have been a lot better if they came in. But what they authorized was NATO to go in, and they handed off the entire operation to NATO. And we know what happened. There was really no oversight after that fact from the UN, even though even the Security Council members, all of them, could have done something in that regard. They could have said, like, what's going on here? Stop this. Our consensus is withdrawn, or there's lots of things that could have happened. But, what if the UN had its own capacity, that were seen as neutral, not as, this is NATO, this is the West coming in again to recolonize the area. And, that generated all these rebel organizations, extreme levels of them. And we have that mess. So, I entirely agree that Libya is one of the better examples of where the UNEPS would have been a great capacity.
And you want to also mention Rwanda, you're saying. Now, you think that there could have been, I guess even Dallaire said there could have been a better outcome if he'd had resources, right?
With 5,000 well-trained soldiers, he might have been able to stop a genocide that murdered 800,000 people. Mm-hmm. So we've known, and we can go through case after case, Darfur, Burundi, South Sudan, Central African Republic. These are almost all examples of where something small might have made a significant difference. And notably, following up on Robin's earlier point, the wild violence in Côte d'Ivoire and in Sierra Leone was actually stopped by a relatively small deployment of special forces. And that led to a broader peace process, which both countries have benefited from enormously. Mm-hmm. We know it was terribly ugly prior, but what we've presented in terms of numbers, I don't think that's overly ambitious, and I think we are erring on ensuring that it's credible, but not a warfighting force. It's not intended for that.
Yeah.
It is really designed to prevent, to protect, and to help. And one of the wider benefits that very few have noted is that it might actually help facilitate a wider disarmament process. You know, since the 60s, governments have known that, and the U.S. State Department conceded under Eisenhower that a UN peace force was really a prerequisite to building the security that states needed to initiate disarmament, which would then free up enormous resources for other pressing challenges.
Yeah.
Along the way, it might take some of the profit out of the war system and allow us to reallocate those urgently needed resources elsewhere.
You can hear me grunting my agreement with you. Let me give you another hypothetical case, or a real case, and that has to do with Syria. And you know, I keep looking for ways of doing things more or less non-violently. And it seems to me that the horrible tragedy of Syria might have, here's an alternative. What if peacekeepers, or call them UNEP, there were such things, went in and set up enclaves and said, here's several square miles of space in the middle of Syria. Now, people who are threatened can come and take refuge here. You got to leave your guns outside. You come inside and we'll protect you. We'll surround this place and these guys are not allowed to come and get you. And you stay here and don't try to get into the Mediterranean and drown, trying to get to Germany. Now, tell me why that wouldn't have worked.
Yeah, let me jump in here, because I think part of this discussion has really been around the important distinction that we need to make between peacekeeping and peace enforcement, and I think that was implicit in the discussion around Libya. I mean, part of the challenge of the scenario you just outlined, Metta, is that peacekeeping is premised and has always been premised on sort of three fundamental pillars: impartiality, non-use of force, except in self-defense, and I think most importantly in this context, the consent of the parties, right? And in particular, the consent of the government. And I just spent a week in New York, and one is reminded that around the UN, this notion of sovereignty and sovereign prerogatives and sensitivities around sovereignty is very much alive and well, and very much, again, the defining concept around which the entire United Nations is framed. So the idea of going in against the will of a sovereign government, whether in Libya, whether in Syria, whether in Darfur, in order to intervene, even if it's for humanitarian purposes, I think runs counter to the basic principle of the consent of the parties, and runs the risk that the UN might be seen as a hostile party by the government on whose territory the UN is occupying. So I think these are remain very sensitive political issues, and countries are sensitive about their own sovereignty, so they're also very sensitive about authorizing missions and mandates that violate the sovereignty of fellow member states. So I think this is part of the larger question that gets kicked around within Security Council discussions.
That's certainly part of the,
that's the problem, that this sovereignty thing is still with us, and maybe we should just talk seriously about the enforcement and the peace enforcement is a violation of sovereignty, isn't it? And
yeah.
So why not expand that notion to a situation such as Syria, where we really did need to protect those people?
So you're raising. Let me put Syria aside as an example, but I think I mean, I would argue that the UN Charter permits protection of human rights, where there's large atrocity crimes impending, and that's why we have a genocide convention, and we have the ICC, and there's all sorts of structure that has been embedded within the Charter that's been associated with it, through the Human Rights Council and so on. There's levels of agreement now, universalized agreement, one would argue, that sovereignty is not an adequate argument for massacring your own populations. So, I would say, prior to the end of the Cold War, that was a less popular argument, at least among states that were competing with each other, and we know that there were many slaughters taking place because sovereignty was used as an excuse to do nothing. So after the Cold War and with Boutros Ghali's report, then Rwanda and former Yugoslavia and these crises and responsibility to protect came into play, and so then the conversation starts to change, and it wasn't this is the right to intervene and use the UN to rubber stamp interventions by the big powers. This was protection of civilians. This is responsibility to protect. It changed the language, right? So peacekeeping is kind of caught in with one foot in both worlds here, and I mean, to a certain extent, I agree with Tim's reticence to hand over a tremendous change in the mandates of UN peacekeepers. But I don't think I would agree with him since Brahimi that it's stand back and watch and don't use force, and I don't think those are the norms anymore. But in that, there's still friction and debate and controversy. I think UNEPs, to a certain extent, provides an opportunity to let peacekeepers be what peacekeepers should be, so that the getting in quickly to prevent escalation and doing some of the tougher stuff could be done. But also, it's not just tougher stuff; it's also a multi-capacity, multifunctional capacity that UNEPs would have that peacekeepers don't have, simply because they're the militaries of national states. They're not the UN for emergency service.
Okay, now you mentioned responsibility to protect. That's the first time it's come into this conversation, but presumably that changes everything, or a little bit anyway. And maybe you can tell us the status of that thing now, because it was controversial at the outset, and if anything, I think it's probably lost legitimacy along the way. Or maybe I'm mistaken. I'd like your thoughts about, or all of your thoughts about, what is this principle of responsibility to protect, and how much credibility, or more than that, how authoritative is it now? How well is it established as a principle of international law?
Can I maybe start, because I'd like sort of partially to respond to Robin's comments as well, and I think R2P is an important part of sort of understanding the larger political dynamic here. I mean, R2P had a life. Normatively, I think it began to take hold. Libya happened, and then I think important permanent members of the Security Council, China and Russia in particular, felt that there was a considerable overstretch in terms of what the Security Council mandated in Libya, and I think it's no coincidence that since Libya, there's been much less discussion of R2P within the Security Council, and much less enthusiasm, to the extent that there ever was enthusiasm on the part of Russia and China in particular, US, I think, as well, about this whole notion of authorizing the use of force in the name of the responsibility to protect. Then I think that gets to some of the larger challenges of reform, because you have countries like, China and Russia, I think, are the the most significant obstacles to any serious reform of the UN's peace and security architecture, again, because they see largely the world through the lens of sovereignty and through the lens of national self-interest. So I think the R2P experience is telling here that normatively the concept actually made some progress. But I think when we saw the reality of it, I think there was a significant backsliding, and I'm actually not sure that R2P has a future, at least in the current configuration of the UN Security Council.
Yeah, I would argue. I mean, I take note of Tim's observation about Libya. We're on one hand. There was a backlash to what happened and the misuse because of the misuse of the authority that the Security Council gave in resolutions 1970, 1973 in 2011. And there was a reluctance, and I agree with Russia and China to be willing to hand over the keys along the R2P format afterwards. But I think there's a bit of a scam as well in that China and Russia could have done something with regards to Libya, but didn't. But also, if you read the discussions amongst the states, the Security Council members, when they created the resolutions for Libya, all of these concerns were raised. They were all known in advance, and yet there were no precautions taken in handing it over to NATO. I mean, NATO could have been constricted as to what they could do. So I'm a little hesitant in agreeing that Russia and China are being totally honest in their critique. At the same time, Maggie Powers did a very interesting study, and I think it was 2014, where she looked at all the statements in the Security Council and the Human Rights Council, and she found that there's actually an significant increase in support for the R2P concept, even after Libya. And not that you see these days, on the front page of the news, another R2P successful mission, but you do see references to that sort of model within the language of the General Assembly, Security Council, and the Human Rights Council. So it's certainly not a dead dog. And more importantly, my question is, what do you do if you have a mass atrocity, another Rwanda coming up? What do you do if you don't do it through the R2P filter? The R2P filter is really not a particularly new idea, other than states should take care of their own first. If they don't, then other states should help. And if that doesn't work, and those states who are maybe the cause of atrocities are not stopping the crisis, then other states should intervene if necessary. But the intervention isn't necessarily military either. So there's a lot of nuance to the R2P.
Great. Well, I think just briefly, and I'll let Peter jump in. But I think Syria over the past 7 years has been sort of a perfect case study of the sort of the gap between the promise and the premise of R2P and the reality of how politics plays out in the international system and in the context of the Security Council. Right, because if there was ever a case for R2P in the last 5 years, Syria would have been that case. So, and we see what happened in the next mass atrocity set of crimes, which has happened in Libya, and the answer is very little has happened.
I'd agree. I don't see UNEPS as a solution to Syria at the moment, but if it had been deployed at the very outset, we might not have had the Syrian war. The problem, as I see it, with R2P is largely that we have a laudable norm that prioritizes prevention of armed conflict and protection of civilians and rebuilding war-torn societies. But we have thoroughly inappropriate destructive means and dated approaches. And so people are justifiably nervous that what we may get in the next R2P is more shock and awe of cruise missiles and bombing from 25,000 feet, and hence another thoroughly destroyed failed state that's a big problem and takes decades to rebuild. Where do we go next? Well, it would be lovely if the R2P supporters and community were strongly inclined, and I think more and more are, toward this option of a UN Emergency Peace Service. Probably half the architects are now on board. And that's encouraging. We're also seeing support from...
Slow down. When you say half the architects are now on board, who do you mean? How much support is there, and where is it? Where does it, where are you feeling it coming from?
I'd say that when you have the people in R2P who I suggest are architects, you're looking at probably Lloyd Axworthy and Gareth Evans at the forefront, Tom Weiss, and a number of the very panel members, those who designed it and wrote it. So that's a unique shift over the last 5 years. That signals the prospect of more. But we're also seeing wider support from prominent UN officials, from leaders of peace operations, from peace and conflict security experts worldwide, and a growing list of NGOs that work in this area. So UNEP's, it's not going to happen this year, probably not next year, but we are seeing even some very prominent political officials who are now endorsing. And
Peter,
that includes one P5 member.
I wonder if I might ask you a question in that context, just because there does seem to be a bit of a disconnect, if you will, between sort of the sense that there is some sort of groundswell of momentum behind the notion of UNEPs, and yet at the same time, a lot of the debate within the UN at the moment around peacekeeping seems to be around reducing peacekeeping budgets, reducing numbers of people in the field.
Sure.
There seems to be sort of pressure for kind of a retrenchment, right? You have these large Christmas tree mandates that these understaffed and underfunded missions are expected to fulfill. And the response seems to be not to add more resources and more personnel, but actually to kind of constrict the mandates and constrict the missions. That's sort of the trend I'm seeing within UN peacekeeping at the moment, is that they're sort of the advocates of peacekeeping are sort of fighting a rearguard battle to try to maintain what they have, let alone build up greater capacity. So I'm just trying
you're absolutely right.
To sense of where that fits within the larger trend.
Well, it couldn't be more correct. The UN's in survival mode, and their major funder is demanding do more with less. Austerity has been really the UN mantra since Bill Clinton's PDF 25 in, I think it was 94, 95. So the organization has been cash starved, and frequently leaves UN operations in the field with insufficient resources to do the jobs assigned. But look, we know with Trump, Bolton, Pompeo, and Haley that we aren't going to see any grand new developments for the United Nations, and no new departure is likely. But this may also be temporal. You know, that which is radical one year can become conservative and accepted the next. And is it conceivable that Jeremy Corbyn and Bernie Sanders actually want to support and help the more vulnerable, and are inclined to a new departure for more effective UN, including peace operations that can prevent and protect. Well, I think that is quite possible. It may still be a long shot, and it's definitely a year and a half away. But for now, we do know that Corbyn and the British Labour Party have endorsed UNEPs, and that's encouraging. We've heard from a number of foreign ministers who are inclined, and they say the nice things, but whether we see action, you can't really expect them to go in against the crowd of bullies that are dominant at the moment.
And that's a political will issue primarily. I mean, no one's denying that that's a problem. I mean, first of all, it does. I mean, I think we're all in agreement that the idea has merit. The timing is the question, and what's going to motivate grasping this wheel and running with it. And so one part of it is the political reluctance, and I mean, there's different levels of it. I mean, there are some large states that I would imagine do not want the UN to take control of the security arrangements and make the world a nicer place. They would prefer to run it on their own. I mean,
I can think of 3 off the top of my head, Robin.
So that's a cynical way, and it's probably realistic in many ways. But it may come down to how is that political will going to shift? So you get one, if you get a Corbyn coming close, then that changes the story. Suddenly it's an issue to be talked about, because Peter was listing some of the architects of R2P and UN leaders, and how their interest has come up. I mean, this didn't this has been over a period of time, but he's got an incredible list of prominent people that now endorse UNEPs. But that's not the statesman. Those are the retired statesmen. It's not the statesman that we want right now. But the other than the political will, there's the economics of it. I mean, when we're spending whatever it is, $14 trillion to pay off war every year, and you look at this thing, which is in the $3 billion a year frame. It's cost effective. It makes sense on because it's early in, early out, and prevents war from going crazy. So it's kind of funny because some would look at it and say, well, gee, that looks like a costly thing, that'll never fly. Well, actually, it's cheap. It's a deal. Like peacekeeping is a deal. I mean, that's I think Boutros Ghali or Nan said that about you could buy there was a cost. No, that the UN was the cost of the New York Postal Service or something, but I think the peacekeeping was the cost of a B-1 bomber or something. Like it's an insanely low cost, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and even that $3 billion estimate for startup of this service. That gets shared proportionally among 193 member states. And we know that if we had something of this nature, it not only helped to prevent escalation and spread of volatile conflicts and deter groups from further violence, it could also cut the length, the size, and the frequency of UN operations. So even with success in just one of those areas, a UNEPs provides a substantive return on the investment. Arguably far more if it leads to a ongoing process of gradually phasing back major military establishments. So,
with an effective UN capacity, I mean, peacekeeping, UNEPs, and so on and so on, you do not need 196 national militaries. I mean, people have, nation states have militaries to protect them because they don't trust neighbors or impending threats, and they don't believe that the UN has the capacity to step in when they need to. So therefore, they will keep it. But you can imagine if you had an effective, credible UN, full range of capacities, what that might do in terms of reduction of armed forces worldwide. You wouldn't need them.
That was the intent of the charter.
Yeah, and this is exactly what I was thinking of in starting this whole process, how to save the world in a hurry, because so many of the global threats are interconnected. For example, war and weapons and militarism and the use of even the maintenance of armed equipment has an enormous effect on global warming. I mean, somebody just pointed out to me that 40% of the Pentagon's budget for any overseas operation goes to transporting the fuel that they will need overseas in their war, whatever it is they're going to be doing. Imagine 40% of the cost of running an operation in Afghanistan or someplace is just to take the fuel over there so that you can burn it and emit it into the atmosphere. Well, hell, I can think of better things to do than that. And I would suggest that if indeed we had we begin to press on countries that you can't afford these military establishments, simply if no other reason, because it's going to kill us with the emissions that you're creating. So if you're going to cut back on your military, then the people are going to say, well, how are we going to defend ourselves? Well, you can defend yourselves by having the UN come in, because we'll have a UNEPS that will take care of you the minute you have a problem. And it seems to me that looking at a solution to any problem like that, any one of those problems, requires us to look at the whole package of problems. So if we want to solve global warming, we have to deal with militarism. If we want to deal with militarism, we have to find an alternative solution for security, at least somebody's version of security, that you do have to have somebody come in with a gun now and then and protect you. And that is why UNEP makes more sense to me. So I think the logic of the whole, looking at all of the ways that these global threats connect with each other, is a very important thing, because now you can get the motivation going. If people couldn't see any reason why they had to get rid of the military before, here we have another reason. And if they couldn't see how they could afford to get rid of the military before, now we have another reason. So all of these link up, right? I mean, you just
no one's ever accused you of lacking ambition, Metta, and I think it makes sense to connect a lot of these things. I mean, the phrase in your conference I always get stuck on is the in a hurry bit, and I don't know if that's meant ironically, but I just think we've had the same UN Security Council structure since 1945 and haven't been able to fundamentally change it. These things change very slowly and with the enormous efforts on a great number of people. So I mean, the in a hurry part is interesting and motivational, but we also, I think, need to be cognizant of the fact that we need to be in for the long haul if any of these things, from a UNEP's force to dealing with climate change, are actually going to, we're actually going to see a difference in them.
Well, I think though, and here we're coming to, it's 9 o'clock, so we've got to stop in a minute, but I think that looking at it comprehensively is exactly what it takes to move it from, that would be nice, but we never can accomplish it, to, oh my God, global warming is going to get us any day now, and we have to do something. So that's the source of hurry that I feel, yes, we have to hurry. It isn't that we want to necessarily, and if you leave it to people in government and at the UN, they won't, but we got to push them. And that's why we have to have a meeting of civil society organizations that from the ground up say, these are the things that we have to have, and that we have to do them together, because we can't do them separately. A lot of things you can't do separately. You have to do them together and then they have some effect. All right? Now,
yes, and if you look at how fast governments have mobilized for war, it's been amazing.
They're very efficient.
Around and mobilizing for peace is rather slow.
Yes, indeed. Although the notion of urgency, I think, is an important one.
Okay.
Well, there's been some urgency to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war since 1945, and we know that the threat's overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
we're into the dark, and I gather this show's over.
Well, the show isn't over until I say goodbye.
Until you say so.
I'm the greeter and the goodbye sayer. And before I say goodbye, I want to thank people for watching. I want to thank you guys for showing up and doing your show, which I think has been a dandy show. And I want to remind people to go to the website, which is tosavetheworld.ca, and find out why you actually have to hurry. And you have to convince Tim to hurry and come on the 30th and the 31st of May to the University of Toronto for a conversation where we look at exactly this kind of issue as a systemic package, a big bundle of solutions that we're going to try to put forward together. So, and I want to remind people to come back next week when, in fact, we're going to pick up on the thing that Robin was most leaning toward in this conversation, and that is the importance of reforming the United Nations in a larger scope than just the issue that we talked today. The United Nations Emergency Peace Service would be one component of a United Nations that might be more competent to solve some of the problems that we have to find solutions toward. And I hope that next time we can get an institution built like the United Nations without having to have something like World War II push us into recognizing the need for it. Anyway, come back next week and we'll have another conversation. And this one will be about the United Nations reform possibilities. And I'm very happy to say good night to all of you and thank you for showing up. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Metta.
Thanks, Metta.
Bye.